What's up, everybody? It's been a couple of weeks since I recorded a UFC video because, well, there was no slate last week. So we had the weekend off last week. We're back to it this week. And what's really not the best card in the world, it's also going to be taking place at altitude. The main event has changed. It was initially Rose Namajunas against Macy Barber. It's now Rose Namajunas against Tracy Cortez. So we're going to be breaking down the slate in full here, giving you everything that you need to know to win some money this weekend playing DraftKings DFS. Do me a favor if you're watching this. Like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We also did a giveaway a couple of weeks ago, have a winner to announce. The question was which fighter for UFC 303 priced under 8K would score the most fantasy points? The winner, it is DVS Roca. He went with Gene Silva for 107 fantasy points. So not only got the answer correct, but also nearly guessed right on the dot how many fantasy points Silva ended up scoring. And funny enough, Silva's fighting again on this card. He ended up taking a short notice fight against Drew Dober. So we'll be breaking all that down here in a second. We'll do another giveaway for this week as well. And by the way, DVS Rocha, send me a DM on Twitter and I'll shoot you over a link to get you a free subscription to OddsShopper, our betting site. And another giveaway for this week. Let's just open up to any fighter on the card. I think it's going to be a high variance card. There should be a lot of finishes, a lot of big scores. But let me know below in the comments which fighter you think will score the most fantasy points for this weekend's card. It could be any fighter at any price. I'll randomly select one person who gets the answer correct to get a free OddsShopper subscription. And then, of course, if you guys want to sign up for any of the tools we have here at Stokastic.com, sign up using the link that we have below. I have found the Sims tools to be really helpful with my process. In fact, I actually just won a PGA DFS tournament for $50,000 on last Sunday. Wouldn't be able to do that if it was not for our Sims tool. So if you guys do want to sign up for any of the products we have here at Stokastic, sign up using the links we have below here in the YouTube description box. But let's start breaking down this week's slate, starting with the main event, which is going to be Rose Namajunas now taking on Tracy Cortez. And I have a bunch of concerns with Cortez for this fight. First of all, she's taking the fight on short notice, took it after Macy Barber had to pull out due to an injury. That's a concern, combined with the fact that this fight is also taking place at altitude. So you have a fighter who's taking a fight on short notice, also at altitude. We've never seen Cortez fight in a 5-round fight before. So now you start to really have to question, how is she going to look in the later stages of the fight, which are not concerns at all for Rose Namajunas. We've seen her do this time and time again. And then on top of it, Tracy Cortez appeared to have a very difficult weight cut. Her first weigh-in this morning, she comes at 127 pounds. So she has to cut a little bit more weight, get back on the scale. She weighs in at 126.5 pounds. And then what she ends up doing is she has to cut off some of her hair. And that was what enabled her to make the 126-pound limit without having anything deducted from her purse. So all those things are concerns for me. I'm very skeptical how she's going to hold up in a 5-round fight, especially in the later stages. We don't have those concerns about Rose Namajunas. And Rose is also the much better striker in this matchup. I do think Tracy Cortez is the fighter on paper who should put out more output, but is she going to be able to keep that output up for 5 rounds considering the concerns I just mentioned? I don't think it's all that likely. I do think the fight is going to go 5 rounds. If there is a finish, I think it's more likely to be on the Namajunas side. And because of the striking advantages that Rose is going to have, I think Cortez is going to have to land takedowns, which I do think she could be able to do in the early stages of the fight. She lands 2.33 takedowns per 15 minutes. Rose doesn't really defend takedowns all that well, just a 59% takedown defense. Rose is the better grappler of the two, so you could see a scenario where Cortez lands takedowns. Rose is able to either get a submission off her back or maybe is able to reverse position and get on top. So I just have a lot of concerns with the path to victory for Tracy Cortez because I do think that Rose is the better grappler. And then also, it is so much energy expenditure to be able to wrestle for 5 rounds. And considering all the factors that I just mentioned, I don't think it's all that likely that she's going to be able to do it. So Rose is going to be my most rostered fighter on the card. I currently have her in 2/3 of my lineups. I'm not going to write off Tracy Cortez just because her path to victory is wrestling, and I do think she has the ability to land takedowns in this matchup. So should she win, I think she puts up a massive DraftKings score, but picking Rose to win, and she is the higher priority fighter for me to be targeting in the main event. Co-main event, and not the fight that I think should be the co-main event. I actually think that should be the Gene Silva-Drew Dober fight because that is guaranteed action. This one is probably going to be a stinker. Maybe there's going to be an early finish. You've got Santiago Ponzinibbio and Muslim Salikov. Both of them are elder fighters at this point. Ponzinibbio, he is 37 years old, turning 38 later on this year. And you now got Muslim Salikov. He's in his 40s now. He turned 40 last month. So age is definitely a concern with both of these fighters, as well as durability. We've seen both of these fighters hurt and finished multiple times. And that also makes me think there's a real chance that both of these veterans are going to be very apprehensive in this fight. So what I think is going to happen is probably going to be a fairly boring, low-paced striking decision. I don't want to completely write these fighters off just because both of them have power and such big durability concerns. You could see a scenario where one of them ends up landing a big shot in the first, maybe the second round, that ends up with one of them scoring a big DraftKings score. But I don't think it's the most likely scenario. And I'm going to be underweight to both sides of this fight. Also, one other thing to note is that this is a smaller card. There's only 12 fights, so it does make it a little bit harder to just write off fights entirely. But I'm not going to be getting to very much of Ponzinibbio or of Salikov. I currently have a little bit more on the Ponzinibbio side, but I mean, by the time that I finalize my lineups tomorrow and actually submit everything prior to lock, I don't expect that I'll have more than like 15% of either fighter in the co-main event. Next fight here, and I think this should be the best fight on the card, Drew Dober taking on Gene Silva. We just saw Gene Silva look terrific in a win on UFC 303, taking on, if you guys looked at the fight against Charles Jourdain, where Jourdain is somebody who's been very durable over the course of his UFC career, and it was just very apparent that Silva had much bigger power. Everything he landed on Charles Jourdain, it stunned him. He was backing up a lot, which is not something we typically see from Charles Jourdain. So as a result, you end up seeing Jourdain reverted to having to wrestle. He did have success there, landed 3 takedowns against Gene Silva, but Silva ends up landing 34 significant strikes, 2 knockdowns before getting that finish in the second round. It was a very impressive showing. And I was on the wrong side of that one for DraftKings purposes. I had a ton of exposure to that fight, but I came in a little bit heavier on the Jourdain side. The reasoning for that was that we had a lot of unanswered questions about Gene Silva. I viewed it as close to a 50-50 fight, and Gene Silva was projected to be a lot more popular, which ended up being the case. And I'm going to end up doing the same thing for this card because we've got Drew Dober projected for 29% ownership. And then we've currently got Gene Silva projected for 37% ownership. So just like at UFC 303, I think this is close to a 50-50 fight. Now, in hindsight, it wasn't a 50-50 fight. It was just a bad read by me. But this is another step up in competition for Gene Silva. He's also moving up a weight class because he's taking the fight on short notice. And then when you also factor in the elevation standpoint, Drew Dober is accustomed to training at elevation. And this is also, like I said, going to be the most difficult test of Gene Silva's career. And Drew Dober also historically has had very good durability. He got finished once in the fight, and by finished, I mean knocked out. We've seen him get submitted before, but we have not really seen Drew Dober knocked out other than the fight against Matt Frevola. Beyond that, Drew Dober's got just a giant coconut face, huge chin on him. He's appeared to be impossible to hurt at points in his career outside of that fight against Matt Frevola. So I do think it's going to be hard to put Drew Dober away. I know Gene Silva showed to have really big power in the win over Charles Jourdain, but this fight is going to be taking place at 155 pounds as opposed to 145 pounds. And also, Drew Dober has wrestling in his back pocket. And when you consider that we just saw Gene Silva taken down 3 times by Charles Jourdain, I think it's a path to victory for Drew Dober, who does land 0.71 takedowns per 15 minutes, which isn't all that high. But there have been times we've seen Drew Dober go to the wrestling when he's had to. So I view this as a very close fight. As far as the actual winner, I don't have a really strong lean. I lean slightly towards Drew Dober, but considering that Silva is going to be the more popular fighter of the two, I'm going to be a little bit overweight to the field on Dober, a little bit underweight to the field on Gene Silva. I think it's a reasonable way to get yourself some leverage building lineups for this card. And also, one other thing, a fight you should have a lot of exposure to. I think it's going to be a war and a really fun fight to target. Gabriel Bonfim taking on Ange Loosa. This is the lesser of the 2 Bonfim brothers. And the big issue with Gabriel Bonfim, just crap cardio, which also becomes a concern now that we're fighting at elevation. There are a handful of fighters I'm going to be talking about in the rest of my analysis here, where there's a lot of fighters that have questionable cardio, and it's going to make me tentative in some of my exposures for these spots because Bonfim is a million times better than Ange Loosa. If we're just talking skill for skill, I think Bonfim has him covered everywhere. Better striker. I think that he has better wrestling, better grappler. I think he's also more durable than Ange Loosa. The problem, though, is very bad cardio for Gabriel Bonfim. And we saw that rear its ugly head in his last fight against Nicholas Dalby, where'd that fight end up ending? It was, so 4.5 minutes into the second round. So towards the tail end of the second round, we saw Bonfim dominate the first round, arguably a 10-8 first round. He wins the early stages of the second round, and then just cardio completely gone, had nothing left in the tank. Dalby comes back and finishes him. And that's the issue I have here with Bonfim with loading up on him for a DFS standpoint. This should be his fight to win. But what happens if the fight gets out of the first round and we're fighting at elevation? Does he just have nothing left in the gas tank to the point where he just completely death gasses and then Angelos is just fighting a punching bag like Nicholas Dalby was in the second round of the last fight? So I think Bonfim should win. I think he should win in the first round. I just can't totally trust him, which is why I'm willing to take some underdog shots on Angelusa, and also why I'm not getting a crazy amount of exposure to Bonfim. He's projected for 30% ownership. I have him in 22% of lineups. Like I said, he should win, but it's just hard to trust somebody who has such poor cardio. I also think there's a good live betting opportunity here. If Bonfim comes out and dominates the first round and it's like a 10-8, and let's say he's something like a minus 800 favorite on the live line, I'll take some shots on Angelusa on the live line. I don't want to bet him before the fight starts because I think he probably loses in the first round. But if he does make it into the second round, I think it's anybody's fight to win there. So Angelos is definitely a live betting target. I'm picking Bonfim to win. For DFS purposes, I'm going to be a little bit underweight to the field on Bonfim because of my concerns about the cardio, and I'll take a couple of shots on Angelos as an underdog. Julian Erosa taking on Christian Rodriguez, and I kind of feel bad for Julian Erosa because he's a very well-rounded fighter. He's really good. He's not great at anything, but he's good everywhere. He's a good striker. He's a good wrestler. He's a good grappler. He's a very good finisher as well. Here's the problem. Shit durability. Terrible. We saw him get... there wasn't a knockdown credit in the fight against Ricardo Ramos, but Ramos hurt him and knocked him down, and then going for the finish, Ramos got a little bit over-aggressive, ends up falling into a guillotine and gets choked out. So we did see Erosa get knocked down in that fight, even if it wasn't officially counted on the stats. Before then, knocked out in the first round by Fernando Padilla. Before that, knocked out in the first round by Alex Caceres. Then had a couple of fights here where his durability held up against Hakeem Dawodu and against Steven Peterson. He beat Charles Jourdain, also one where he was losing the fight, got knocked down early, ends up coming back and wins by submission, then ends up getting knocked out in the fight before that against Sung Woo Choi. So in just about every single fight Erosa is in, he either gets finished or gets hurt and has to come back and end up winning the fight. And here's where I'm really interested in some of the betting lines here. Is considering that Erosa does have a really well-rounded skill set, but his weakness is his durability, it's interesting to me that this fight is right around a pick'em to go to the judges' scorecards, which makes me think Erosa is maybe a little bit undervalued as an underdog. I think Christian Rodriguez is really good, but like I said, I kind of think that Julian Erosa has really good, well-rounded skill set as well. Christian Rodriguez also has to be fighting at 145 pounds now, so he's going to be much smaller. You guys could see here that Julian Erosa actually has a 6-inch height advantage and a 3-inch reach advantage over Christian Rodriguez. So he's a much bigger athlete here. Rodriguez missed weight at 135 pounds. I don't even remember how many times now, like 3 times or something like that. So the UFC just forced him to move up to 145 pounds. And that's one of the reasons why I do think that Erosa probably has a little bit better of a chance to survive this fight than he has other ones. It's always scary to be picking Erosa to win a fight because he could just get knocked out at any point in time. But I don't know that Christian Rodriguez is the man to knock him out. So if this fight does go to the judges' scorecards, I think we could see Erosa eke out a decision here. So he's going to be an underdog that I'm willing to get exposure to. Overall, it's not my favorite fight to be targeting on the entire slate. I think there's other ones to be getting to. I'm also willing to take shots on Christian Rodriguez in the event that Erosa's durability is just so shot that he gets knocked out by anything. But I actually do like being slightly overweight to both sides of this fight. Abdul Razak Al Hassan against Cody Brundage. Another really, really good fight to target. This fight is nearly minus 500 to finish inside the distance, and I do expect it to finish in the first round. So I think somebody's putting up a big score. If Abdul Razak Al Hassan wins, I think it's probably going to be either a first round knockout, maybe a second round knockout. If Cody Brundage wins, I think it could come either by knockout, potentially by ground and pound, maybe a submission in the first, also potentially the early second round. If the fight does happen to go to the judges' scorecards, I think is very unlikely, but possible to happen, outside chance. I do think Brundage would be the one who would win the decision, and I think he would score pretty well in that because I think that his path to victory is going to have to be via the wrestling, and we've seen that he's somebody who's willing to go out and wrestle. Both of these fighters have bad cardio, so it's going to be really sloppy if it makes out of the first round. But we do have on the Brundage side, he lands about 2.5 takedowns per 15 minutes, and Abdul Razak Al Hassan only has 50% takedown defense. If you guys remember, one of the better prop betting wins that I had last year, if you've been following my video for a while, it was betting on Joe Pyfer to win by submission against Abdulrazak Alhassan. Ended up betting him to win not only by submission, but also bet him to win by submission in the second round of that fight. And I do think there's something live similarly that could potentially happen here with Cody Brundage. If fighters look to wrestle against Abdulrazak Alhassan, they typically have success. And we do see Cody Brundage as a fighter who has had success wrestling at times in his fight. The problem is just his really poor fight IQ, and he'll do random shit sometimes like, hey, I'm just going to pull guard, like in the fight against Cedricus Dumas, where Dumas won by literally doing nothing because Brundage would start rounds by going for takedowns. He would land them, and then all of a sudden he would get into a position where he'd just try to pull guillotine and he'd wind up on bottom. Then Dumas would just sit on top of him for the entire round. So I don't trust the fight IQ of Cody Brundage. But all that aside, I think somebody scores big in this fight. I think somebody gets finished. The betting lines indicate that as well. And this is another one of these fights where I do think it's close to, I'm not going to say 50-50. I'm going to say like 60-40. I think Abdulrazak Alhassan wins. But we've got Alhassan 41% owned, whereas Brundage is only 24% owned. So I'm right around even with the field on Alhassan, slightly overweight to Cody Brundage. Currently have this fight in about 80% of my lineups. It's a really good one to target, arguably the best fight to target on the entire card. I'll be a little bit overweight to the field on Brundage and then about even with the field on Alhassan. It's hard to get too much more overweight to the field on somebody who's project for 40% ownership. So I'm right even with the field on Alhassan. And I think you're getting good leverage play in Cody Brundage at just over 20% ownership. Next fight here, Joshua Van against Charles Johnson. Joshua Van's one of my most favorite young prospects to watch just because his fights have been so exciting. He fights at a tremendously high pace, landing 9.08 significant strikes per 15 minutes. Typically, the path to beating Charles Johnson is with the wrestling. He only defends takedowns at a 67% clip. And we've also seen that when fighters put a really heavy wrestling and grappling pace on him, he can be broken in the later stages of fights. I don't think it's what Joshua Van is going to do here, though. I think these guys are going to stand and trade. I think it's going to be fought at a fairly high pace. And these are guys, at times we've seen Charles Johnson get tired at the end of fights, but that's typically because those are in wrestling fights. Striking, I think he could do all day. There's been no indications that Joshua Van will slow down in his fights. So I think we're going to be getting a very high-paced striking output on the feet here. I think Joshua Van wins. I think he wins by decision. But even by decision, Joshua Van, I think, could still put up a really big DraftKings score just because of what his outputs look like in some of these fights. I mean, against Felipe Bunes, he ended up landing 83 significant strikes in a fight that he ended up finishing in the second round. Against Kevin Borjas, he landed 156 significant strikes, also added a couple takedowns in that fight. And then against Zhalga Zhumagulov, Joshua Van landed 120 significant strikes. So considering you're not paying a premium price tag for him, you could see an outcome here where Van wins a decision, maybe as a knockdown at some point, lands like 150 significant strikes, and puts up a pretty big DraftKings score. So I'm picking Joshua Van to win, and I think that he's somebody who's worth getting some exposure to for DFS as well. As far as Charles Johnson, I don't love him as an underdog just because I am fairly confident that Joshua Van ends up winning because of the high-paced output of this fight. You could see a scenario where maybe there aren't any underdogs that win, and Charles Johnson scores like 50, 55 fantasy points in a decision loss. So I'll have some exposure to him as an underdog, but I much prefer the Joshua Van side of this fight. Jasmine Jasudavicius against Fatima Klein. Klein appears to be a very good prospect. It seems she could do a little bit of everything as well. We don't have that much of a sample size on her. She only has 6 professional fights. But from what we've seen from her on the regional scene, she could wrestle, she could grapple, and that's primarily what her game plan is, and she also does it at a pretty high clip. We've also seen that she is decent striking, although she is a little bit more apt to go to the wrestling and grappling. The issue I have with Klein in this fight, and you could see here that where the weights are listed on the UFC website, Klein is listed at 115 pounds, Jasudavicius 125 pounds. Klein took this fight on about a week's notice, so she took it on very short notice, and then also was moving up a weight class because she wasn't able to potentially cut all the way to 115 pounds. So she has to take a fight at 125 pounds against a very physical fighter. I do think Jasudavicius is going to be the bigger and stronger of the two athletes here. So I do worry a little bit that could this be a fight that just kind of takes place in a lot of neutral positions where these two fighters are pushing each other up against the cage and just there's a lot of stalling, not all that many fantasy points being scored. This fight is also very likely to go to the judges' scorecards. It's something like minus 250 to minus 300. Last I looked, to end up to end up going to the judges' scorecards and to be going to decision. So I'm really interested in Klein as a prospect. I don't think this is the best matchup for her, just considering the late notice factors combined with it taking place at altitude and her being the smaller of the two, which I think is a little bit detrimental to her fight style. So I'm going to lean towards Klein to win as my pick just because I think she's the better fighter overall. But some of the other unknown factors just has me think this fight might not score all that well for DraftKings purposes. I'm not all that high on it. I've got Jazz DeVicious right now in sub 20% of lineups. And then I've also got Klein as well in sub 20% of lineups. And I'll probably come down even further on that as we get closer to lock. If I have to pick a side, like I said, I'll be a little bit more on Klein. My first run of lineups, I'm a little bit higher on Jazz DeVicious. That won't be the case when the slate actually locks, but not a fight that I'm all that interested in relative to the other ones on the card, a fight that should go to the judges' scorecards. And we do have a lot of fights that I expect to finish inside the distance. Montel Jackson against Damon Blackshear, another fight that's being taken on short notice, and another concern for me because in the past, Damon Blackshear has had cardio concerns. In his fight against Mario Bautista, he looked great in the early going. Damon Blackshear looked like a fantastic live dog. I had also bet him in that spot against Mario Bautista and through a couple of rounds. I thought I was going to end up winning that bet. And then he gasses out in the third round, which you've also seen in other fights. He got tired in the late stages against Farid Basharat. Against Yusuf Zalal, Damon Blackshear looked great in the first couple of rounds and then gasses out and gets 10-8'd in the third round. So now when you got Damon Blackshear fighting at altitude and a fight that's taken place on short notice, I just can't confidently say that his cardio is going to hold up over 3 rounds. And Montel Jackson's a really strong finisher. So I think more often than not, Blackshear wins the first round. I think more often than not, Blackshear probably wins the second round as well, although Montel Jackson is live to finish Blackshear because he is the better striker of the two. But it's just hard for me to pick Blackshear as an underdog, where even though I think that he has the skill set to win this fight, Montel Jackson defends takedowns at a 69% clip. We've seen him taken down numerous times by lesser wrestlers and grapplers than Damon Blackshear. JP Bays took him down. Brett Johns took him down 8 times. Felipe Colares was able to take him down. Andre Sukumtat was able to take him down. Ricky Simone, who we saw last card, really put up a stinker in his fight. He took down Montel Jackson 7 times. So there is a clear game plan for Damon Blackshear to end up winning this fight. I just don't know that his cardio is going to allow him to implement it. If he does hold up over 3 rounds, I think he wins a decision. And I think he scores pretty well for DraftKings purposes just because he has to wrestle and grapple in this matchup. But if his cardio fails him, Montel Jackson probably finishes him in the later stages of the fight, or maybe even 10-8s him in the third, and we get another one of those Yusuf Zalal fights out of Blackshear where it ends up being a draw because he wins the first 2 rounds and gets 10-8'd in the third. I think there's a little bit more upside on the Blackshear side because of that wrestling and grappling ability, and that there aren't that many underdogs that I love for this card. So with that being the case, I currently have Blackshear in 25% of lineups, whereas I have, where's Montel Jackson in my lineups here? Yeah, I only have about 10% of Montel Jackson right now. The biggest problem I have with Montel Jackson is just that I think that Blackshear is so likely to win the first round. And the way that he's going to do it is probably just by wrestling and neutralizing Montel Jackson. You could see Jackson having a second or third round knockout in a win and it not scoring all that well because of how limited opportunities he's going to have to strike if he gets taken down the early going by Blackshear. So my preferred DFS target is going to be Damon Blackshear. I'll tentatively pick him to win by decision, but it should be a competitive fight with contrasting styles. I would feel different about the fight if it wasn't taking place at altitude or if Blackshear wasn't taking it on short notice. Luana Santos taking on Maria Agapova. And Agapova, I think she might be homeless right now. If you guys have checked out her social media feed, she was begging the UFC for her fight. She said she didn't have any money. It had been a really long time for her in between fights because of injuries that she had dealt with. So we have not seen her fight in nearly 2 years when she got submitted by Jillian Robertson. And there is a very clear path to beating Maria Agapova that we've seen implemented time and time again. She's a terrific striker. When she first came into the UFC, she was viewed as a blue chip prospect that had potential to fight for a championship at one point. And then we just saw her get exposed as having 0 wrestling and 0 grappling. So she has just a 47% takedown defense. When fighters get on top of her, they typically either end up submitting her or getting a lot of control time. So Jillian Robertson takes her down 3 times, submits her. Marina Moroz takes her down 2 times, submits her. She fights Sabina Mazo. That was a fight where she was able to avoid the takedowns, ends up winning that one. Shayna Dobson, where Agapova was something like off the top of my head, she was like a -1,000 favorite in that fight, and she was like $9,600 on DraftKings. She looks great, wins by arguably a 10-8 in the first round. I think it was a 10-8 in the first round, nearly had Shayna Dobson finished. And then she gasses out, and Dobson's just able to overwhelm her with wrestling and ends up finishing her in the second round. So massive holes in Agapova's game. And because of the 2-year layoff and her living situation and everything else that surrounds her, you just don't know how well trained she's going to be for this fight. And we do have somebody here in Luana Santos who's capable of landing takedowns, which you think she has to know that's her clearest path to victory. If the fight takes place on the feet, yeah, Agapova is live to win as an underdog. But if Santos is smart, she just goes, lands takedowns, holds a bunch of top control time, maybe gets a submission, and comes out with a win where she scores pretty decently for DFS. So I'm going to pick Santos to win, going to pick her to win by submission. I'm a little bit underweight to the field on her, not because I don't have confidence in her ability to win or anything like that, but more so because I do question a little bit what kind of game plan she's going to implement. We don't always see her go for takedowns in her fights, and there are other fighters that I really like on the high end as well. So Luana Santos, my pick to win. I have her in a chunk of lineups, but just slightly underweight to the field where she's projected for 34% ownership. But she's for sure a good target, and I would like to get a little bit more of her. It's just an opportunity cost thing where there's other fighters that I like slightly more than her. I love this fight as well. Josh Fremd against Andre Petroski. And Petroski's the better fighter everywhere. This is kind of similar to when I was talking about the fight between Gabriel Bonfim and Angelusa, just not quite to the same extreme, where Andre Petroski, I think, is the better striker. I think he's the better wrestler. I think he's the better grappler. Two issues: shit cardio, shit durability. The last fight Petroski was in, the finish didn't even make sense. He looked, I don't want to say he looked good in the first round against Jacob Malkoun, because the first round of that fight was terrible, but he won the first round. And then in the second round, he shoots for a takedown. He hits his head on the side of Malkoun's hip and just gets knocked out by that. It was the weirdest finish I've ever seen. And because of that, and because of the other fights we've seen from Andre Petroski, you have to question his durability, and he's gassed out time and time again. So now we have a fight that's taking place at altitude. I kind of think Petroski is first or early second round finish or bust. If he doesn't do that, I think Fremd either finishes him late or just overwhelms him and wins the decision. So Petroski's the better fighter here. He's also going to be more popular on DraftKings per our ownership projections. It's just really hard for me to trust the durability as well as the cardio at this point in his career. If you told me that Petroski could fight hard 3 rounds for this fight, then I go, oh, cool, he wins this fight easily. But I just don't know how you can be confident in that. So as a result, I've got Josh Fremd right now in 43% of my lineups. He's only projected for 21% ownership. And on the other side, where we've got Petroski projected for, where's Petroski? We just type it in. Yeah. So Petroski project for 30% ownership. I'm just kind of flipping the exposures here to get underweight to Petroski and get overweight to Josh Fremd. I do think it's a really, really close competitive fight, 50-50 to win, not in terms of the actual minute for minute, but just because I think Petroski is going to be winning the fight until he either gets knocked out or just the wheels completely fall off and his cardio fails him. So I do think, like I said, Petroski is the better fighter, but I just don't trust him. So I'm going to slightly favor Josh Fremd to win. And I think he's a great leverage target on DraftKings for about half of the ownership of Andre Petroski. And then finally, we have Evan Elder taking on Darius Flowers. And this is another really weird fight because this fight was booked 4 days ago, and now it's taking place also at altitude. And Flowers is another fighter who is horrific cardio. So Flowers is going to be really dangerous for the first 2.5 minutes of the fight. He could potentially finish Elder in those first couple minutes, which is why I'm willing to take some dart throws on Darius Flowers. But if this fight goes past 2 minutes, maybe past 3 minutes, I'll give Flowers 3 minutes to win the fight. If it gets past 3 minutes, Evan Elder wins the fight and puts up a really big DraftKings score. Darius Flowers, we have seen him just time and time again in these kind of situations, not just in the UFC, but also outside of the UFC. Against Jake Matthews, he looks competitive early, gets just gassed out, and then looks terrible. Honestly, he looked terrible past 90 seconds in that fight. Against Michael Johnson, Flowers didn't even look good in the first 90 seconds of that fight. It looked like he kind of tried to conserve his cardio, knowing of some of those issues he had, and he just kind of ended up doing nothing in the fight as Michael Johnson was able to take him down pretty easily, was able to put up a decent DraftKings score in that fight. So Darius Flowers, if he wins, basically the first 3 minutes of the fight is the same as his money line. So if you wanted to bet Darius Flowers, you're betting to win by first round finish. If it gets outside of that, Evan Elder wins, probably gets a finish in the late first round or early second round. So Elder, if you have the ability to spend up for him, he's the guy to get to. I have him in 38% of lineups. I'm kind of surprised he's not projected to be all that popular. Maybe that'll change as we get closer to lock tomorrow, but Evan Elder, sub 20% ownership in a matchup against Darius Flowers at altitude. That's pretty appealing to me. The winner of this fight should score really well. I'm going to be overweight to both sides of it. And that's going to do it for me. If you guys haven't done it yet, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you want to sign up for any of the tools at Stochastic, link below in the description box. And don't forget to leave a comment. Which fighter scores the most fantasy points this week? I'll pick one person at random who gets the answer correct to get a free Odd Shopper subscription. Enjoy the card. Good luck. See you guys back here next week.